Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I live 10 miles outside of Seeley Lake, Montana, where the pines crowd in close and the night gets so quiet you can hear the snow settle off the branches. My place is a small log-sided house that used to be somebody's hunting cabin. I added insulation, ran a proper service panel, and built a little radio room off the back wall that looks out toward the Blackfoot Clearwater drainage. It's not fancy, but it's mine, and it has the one thing that makes all the hours I spend alone out here feel like a choice instead of a sentence. A station that can reach past the ridgelines. I'm not a professional anything. I'm not military. I'm not law enforcement. I'm a 41-year-old heavy equipment mechanic who fell in love with amateur radio the way some people fall in love with old trucks, because the logic is clean and the pieces make sense. Electricity flows. Antennas resonate. Propagation changes, but it changes for reasons you can learn. My call sign is KE7, something I won't say out loud anymore. The radio room smells like warm dust and solder. A sturdy desk sits against the wall, and above it I built a shelf that holds my transceiver, power supply, antenna tuner, and a little SDR receiver I use for scanning. Coax comes through a bulkhead plate I mounted into the wall with a proper ground bus tied into an 8-foot copper rod outside. I installed a lightning arrestor because I live in a place where summer storms arrive like something angry and personal. I keep a deep cycle battery under the desk in case the power goes out. After the windstorm last spring, I added a small solar panel on a pole by the woodpile and wired it into a charge controller, just enough to keep the battery topped off. It's practical, it's careful, it's the kind of setup you build when you don't like surprises. Which is why, when the first strange signal showed up, my brain tried very hard to make it fit into a box labeled propagation weirdness, or somebody's amplifier splattering, or foreign broadcast bleeding into an empty part of the band. It didn't fit. That evening had been normal enough. I got home late, hands still smelling like diesel and hydraulic oil from a job replacing a loader's steering cylinder in Ovando. I ate leftover chili, fed the dog, and watched a few minutes of weather on the local station out of Missoula. Cold front coming through. Clear skies after midnight. Wind light. One of those nights where the stars feel close enough to snag on a pine needle. By 11:30, I was in my radio room with a mug of coffee I didn't need. My dog, Juniper, a mutt with shepherd ears and a lab body, curled up on her blanket by the door. The little room's only window was dark, reflecting the faint glow of my equipment back at me. I powered up my main transceiver, an ICOM IC7300 I'd saved up for, and let it settle. The waterfall display painted the band noise in blues and greens. I listened around 40 meters for a while, not transmitting much, just checking what was out there. Nighttime on 40 can be a busy place, the band stretching and skipping across the continent and beyond. Voices from thousands of miles away arriving in a Montana cabin as if they were coming from the next room. At about midnight, I spun the dial upward out of habit, past where the amateur allocations end in the United States. I wasn't hunting for trouble. I like listening to shortwave broadcasters sometimes, and there are utility signals that can be interesting if you know what you're hearing. 7 megahertz can carry a lot at night, and the farther you go from the ham portion, the less it sounds like a community, and more it sounds like a crowded parking lot after a storm. That's when I landed on 7.400 megahertz. The frequency itself is what stopped me first. 7.4 isn't in the amateur bands here. It's an odd place to hear anything stable. Usually it's noise, fading broadcast stations, or nothing at all. But there was something there, strong, centered exactly on the frequency like it had been nailed into place. not drifting, not warbling. I leaned closer to the speaker, hand on the volume knob. A voice was repeating a message in English that sounded like it had been recorded through a broken phone and played back underwater. The cadence was wrong, like someone had heard English once and decided to assemble it from memory. The words were stretched and then compressed. Consonants popped, vowels smeared. The message looped every 9 seconds. Do you hear us? Pause. Do you hear us? Pause. Do you hear us? No call sign, no identifier, no music, no station name. Just that question, repeated with the same distorted emphasis as if the transmission didn't care whether someone answered. It only cared whether someone was listening. My first instinct was to check my own gear. I glanced at the transmit meter. I wasn't keyed. I wasn't broadcasting. The noise floor looked normal everywhere else. I grabbed my small handheld recorder, the kind I use to log strange sounds for equipment diagnostics sometimes, and set it on the desk, pointed at the speaker. Then I started doing the boring checks that keep you sane. I verified the frequency readout with a second receiver, an SDR dongle on a separate antenna running on my laptop. Same signal. Same strength. Same exact wording. I tried different modes. Upper sideband, lower sideband, AM. The clearest was AM, but even then the signal sounded like it was being pushed through a throat that wasn't built for speech. The signal strength was steady enough that it didn't feel like far-off propagation. It sounded close. Local. But local signals on 7.4 are unusual because nobody who wants to stay out of trouble transmits there with voice. I checked time signals. I checked the local FM radio in the kitchen. Normal. I checked my cell phone, 1 bar as usual. No alerts, no messages. Juniper lifted her head when the voice repeated again. Her ears angled forward, and she stared at the wall, not at the speaker. That should have been my warning. Dogs don't care about radio, they care about tone, vibration, and the way a room changes when something is wrong. I turned the volume down and listened closer, almost holding my breath. There was something else under the words. A faint, irregular clicking, like a relay switching, or like someone tapping a fingernail against plastic. It didn't match the loop timing. It didn't have a pattern I could grab onto. I logged the time in my notebook, wrote the frequency in big numbers, and scribbled, unknown voice loop, AM, strong, steady. Then, because I'm the kind of person who takes comfort in rules, I did what you're supposed to do when you hear a suspicious transmission. You don't respond on that frequency. You don't acknowledge. You don't try to be clever. But I did something else. Something I would later regret in a way that felt less like regret and more like a bruise that never fades. I whispered to no one. Yeah, I hear you. Not into the microphone, not on the air, just into the room, like saying it might make the hair on my arms settle down. The voice stopped. It didn't fade, it didn't drift away, it stopped as if somebody had lifted a needle off a record. For 2 full seconds, there was only the hiss of the receiver. Then the speaker crackled, and the voice came back, closer and cleaner than before, still distorted but with a new sharpness at the edges. Evan? My name? Not a guess. Not sir or operator. My actual name. Said with the wrong mouth. Juniper stood up so fast her claws clicked on the floor. A low sound came out of her throat, not quite a growl, not quite a whine. She looked at the wall again, the one behind my desk where the coax and ground bus ran through. I sat perfectly still, hands hovering over the controls, my heart pounding in a way that felt childish. My brain went through the usual checklist of explanations people cling to when they're scared. Somebody's playing a prank. Somebody's monitoring me somehow. I left my name on a log post online. My call sign is registered publicly, and my name is in a database. But none of those explanations fit the fact that I hadn't transmitted anything. I hadn't called CQ. I hadn't even keyed up that night. There was no reason for anyone to be focused on me specifically. In my cabin, at midnight, on a frequency I wasn't supposed to be using. The voice said it again. Evan. Then, with a pause that felt like something leaning in close, it asked, "Do you hear us now?" My hand moved without my permission. I reached for the power button. Then I stopped. Because the human brain is capable of being both rational and ridiculous at the same time, and mine supplied a thought that held my finger in midair. If I shut it off, I won't know what it does next. Curiosity is a tidy word for a messy impulse. It's the same impulse that makes you slow down at the edge of a cliff to look down, even when you know it's dangerous. It's the reason people open doors marked with warnings. I didn't answer, not out loud, not into the mic. I just listened. The voice didn't repeat the whole loop anymore. It started shifting, as if it had been waiting for my attention, and now it had permission to improvise. Evan McCready, it said, and my stomach tightened because I don't use my last name on the air. Then it began listing things in a flat, careful way. The dog, Juniper, the wood stove, the coffee you do not need, the wrench in the drawer, the picture on the fridge. My eyes flicked to the doorway. The fridge was in the kitchen. I could see a sliver of it from where I sat, white against the dimness, with magnets holding up an old photo of my dad and me on a fishing trip near Great Falls. The kind of photo you keep because it proves something simple used to be true. The voice continued, as if reading the room, not describing it. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was worse than that. It was calm. I finally pressed the power button. The receiver went dark. The room suddenly felt like it had lost a layer of pressure. For a moment, relief washed through me so hard my eyes stung. Then Juniper's head snapped toward the wall again, and from the blank speaker with the radio completely off came a whisper, barely audible, like breath on glass. "Do you hear us?" I jerked back so fast my chair legs scraped the floor. The hair on my arms rose up, and the cold that spread in through my chest felt physical, like inhaling winter air too fast. The speaker wasn't powered. It was an ordinary built-in speaker. There was no battery inside it. The transceiver was off. My eyes went to the wall outlet. I half expected to see sparks or smoke or something that would let me blame electricity. There was nothing. Juniper started barking, not at the speaker, but at the corner where the wall met the floor, where I drilled a hole for coax and sealed it with foam and silicone. She barked like there was something on the other side trying to come through. I did the only thing that felt remotely like control. I stood up, grabbed the dog by the collar to keep her from scratching through drywall, and backed out of the room. I shut the door hard enough that the frame rattled. In the kitchen, the house felt normal. The refrigerator hummed. The wood stove ticked softly as it cooled. The clock above the sink showed 12:26. I stood there with my hand on the doorknob, staring at the radio room door like it was a mouth. From the other side, faintly, I heard the same whisper again. "Evan." Not through the speaker. Not through electronics. Just there, in the space behind the wall, as if the cabin itself had learned my name and wanted to practice it. I slept maybe 40 minutes that night. On the couch with the dog pressed against my legs, a flashlight and my phone on the cushion beside me, and a long gun I hadn't touched in months leaned against the coffee table because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. At 3:10 in the morning, I woke up because Juniper lifted her head and stared at the ceiling. There was a faint tapping sound above us, like someone walking in soft shoes across the attic space. I held my breath and listened. The tapping moved slowly from one end of the house toward the other, following the line where the ceiling joists would be. It paused above the radio room, and I heard something else. A soft, wet sound, like someone whispering with their mouth too close to a microphone. I stayed still. I didn't speak, I didn't even swallow. The tapping moved away toward the kitchen and then stopped. Silence settled in, heavy and complete. I didn't go back into the radio room until daylight. When the sun finally showed up, pale and cold through the trees, I tried to convince myself the night had been a weird dream. Maybe I'd dozed off with the radio on. Maybe the whisper came from the wind in the vent pipe. Maybe the dog had been reacting to a mouse in the wall. The problem with those explanations is that they sound reasonable right up until you try to fit my full name into them. I opened the radio room door carefully. The air inside smelled the same as always. No burnt electronics, no ozone, no sign of anything that had happened. The ICOM sat on the shelf, powered off. The microphone hung on its hook. The recorder I'd set on the desk was still there. I pressed play. The recording captured the loop. "Do you hear us?" repeated. It captured the sudden stop. It captured the moment the voice said my name. Clear enough that my skin prickled hearing it in daylight. And then, right after I turned the radio off, the recording captured something else, faint but unmistakable. The whisper that came from the dead speaker. "Do you hear us?" My throat went dry. This wasn't in my head. This wasn't a dream. I did what I always do when something doesn't make sense. I looked for a technical explanation. I spent the morning checking cables, swapping power supplies, moving the station to a different circuit. I inspected the ground connection. I checked the coax shield. I made sure my microphone cable wasn't acting like an antenna and picking up a local AM broadcast. I even unplugged everything and carried the transceiver out to my truck, set it on the seat, and listened on a completely different battery source. At noon, I scanned around 7.4 again, using the SDR and a small portable shortwave receiver I keep as a backup. The signal was there again. Same strength, same calm voice. But now, it wasn't asking if I could hear it. Now, it was saying, "We know you," over and over, steady as a metronome. I didn't answer. I didn't whisper. I didn't even think the words in my mouth. I shut it off and walked outside, breathing cold air hard enough to hurt. Across the valley, the pines stood still. Snow flashed in the sun. A raven croaked somewhere near the road. The world looked like the world. I drove into town that afternoon because staying alone felt like a mistake. Seeley Lake isn't big, but it has enough people that you can pretend the rules of reality are enforced by the sheer number of witnesses. I stopped at the gas station by the highway, bought a coffee, and stood by the window pretending to check my phone while I listened to the conversations around me. At first, everything was normal. Talk about the cold, talk about the road conditions. A couple guys in hunting jackets discussing a broken snowmobile. Then, I heard a woman near the counter say, "You heard about the radio thing?" The clerk, a tired man in a beanie, nodded without looking up. My cousin in Condon says his scanner picked up some weird voice last night. Another customer leaned in. "On what?" "Some shortwave number," the woman said. 7.4, something. My grip tightened on my coffee cup. Heat burned my palm, anchoring me to the floor. The clerk finally looked up. "The sheriff says it's probably somebody messing around, but there's folks up by Swan Lake talking about it too." A man behind me chuckled in a way that wasn't amused. "My brother's got one of those ham setups. He said the voice used his name." The woman frowned. "That's what I'm saying. It's like it's listening. They all fell quiet for a moment, the way people do when the shape of a fear comes into focus. Then someone changed the subject, because that's what humans do when they're standing too close to something they can't fix. I left without saying anything. By the time I got home, my phone had 1 bar and a new notification from the county emergency system. It wasn't a weather advisory. It was a plain text alert. Emergency notice, report unauthorized radio transmissions, do not engage. No details, no frequency, no explanation. I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Half an hour later, the power blinked. Not a full outage, just a quick flicker that made the lights dip and the refrigerator click. In the radio room, the transceivers stayed off, but the little SDR on my laptop flashed like it had caught a spike. I didn't like that. I didn't like anything about a situation where the air itself felt interested. I did something I should have done right away. I called someone who would laugh at me, because laughter is a kind of test. If someone laughs, maybe the world is still normal. I called my friend Travis, a line worker who lives outside of Clearwater Junction. He's the kind of guy who fixes high-voltage lines in blizzards and complains about the coffee while doing it. He's also the reason I got into radio in the first place. He used to carry a handheld and call me when he was bored on storm duty. He answered on the second ring. "What's up, Evan?" I tried to keep my voice casual. "You hear anything about a weird radio transmission last night?" There was a pause that told me his face had changed. "Yeah," he said. "Don't tell me you heard it too." I swallowed. 7.4. "Yep." His voice dropped. "My neighbor, old man Harlan, he's got a shortwave set. He picked up a voice loop, said it started saying his name." My stomach clenched. Did he respond? Travis exhaled hard. He said he yelled at it. Told it to knock it off. He's 72 and stubborn. And? Travis didn't answer right away. I felt the silence like a weight. "Travis." "He's gone," Travis said finally, and the words sounded wrong, coming from him, too simple for what they implied. His truck's still in the driveway. His front door was open this morning. Wife called it in, sheriff came out, no sign of him. No footprints in the snow, Evan. Fresh snow, no tracks. My grip tightened on the phone. My mind tried to picture a person leaving without leaving evidence, and it refused. Travis continued, voice low. "They're saying maybe he wandered off confused, but there's no tracks. It's like he vanished." A cold sweat broke across my back. "I didn't respond," I said. "Not on the radio." Travis hesitated. "But did you talk to it?" The question made my throat close. I said something out loud, not into the mic, just in the room. Travis went quiet. "Evan," he said, and his voice had a rough edge now. "Don't do that again." "I'm not planning to." "Good, because there's talk," he said. "And I don't mean internet talk. I mean the kind of talk that happens between deputies and linemen and dispatchers who aren't supposed to say anything. They're calling it the voices. Like it's not one signal, like it's a thing." A shiver ran up my arms. "What do you mean, a thing?" "I mean, they're telling folks not to answer it," Travis said. "And they're not saying why." As if to prove him right, my phone buzzed with another alert. This one wasn't county. It was the emergency alert system, the kind that overrides everything, that uses the same backbone as weather warnings and evacuation orders. My phone screen lit up with bold text in a shrill tone that made Juniper bark. "Emergency alert, do not respond to the voices." For a moment, I just stared at it, my brain snagging on the absurdity of the wording. It sounded like something from a late-night horror movie. It didn't sound like government language. It didn't sound like the careful, boring phrasing agencies use to avoid panic. Travis let out a breath on the other end of the line. "You got it, too." "Yeah. Okay," he said, and now he sounded like he was trying to be the calm one, which was rare for him. "Listen to me. Shut your station down. Unplug it, don't transmit, don't listen if you don't have to." "I already shut it off." "Good," Travis said, "and if you hear it again, don't answer. Don't talk about it, don't even joke." I wanted to tell him I couldn't promise anything about what happened inside my walls, but I didn't say that. I didn't want his laugh. I didn't want his fear either. We hung up after a few more words that didn't solve anything. The rest of the day, the alert played on the radio in my truck. It popped up on the TV. It scrolled across the bottom of local news broadcasts with the same unsettling phrase: "Do not respond to the voices." Every official source denied any involvement with experimental transmissions. A spokesperson from some agency I didn't recognize said they were investigating reports of unauthorized radio interference. The sheriff's office posted a short statement asking residents to avoid engaging with unknown broadcasts. Nobody said what engaging meant. Nobody said what happened to the people who did. But by evening, the story started. A woman in Lincoln posted on social media that her husband responded to a voice on his CB radio and then just walked out of the house and didn't come back. A hunter near Alberton claimed he heard his name called from his handheld and answered, and then his buddy turned around and he was gone, leaving his orange vest on the ground like he'd shrugged out of it. A family in St. Regis said their teenage son laughed at the alert, went into his room, and started talking to someone through the wall. When his mother opened the door, he was sitting on the floor, smiling, speaking words she didn't recognize, and the air in the room was cold enough to fog her breath. Half of it sounded like panic. Half of it sounded like people telling stories because people always tell stories. Then I heard about the survivor. It came from Travis first, late that night. He called again, voice tight. They found a guy. Where? Off a forest road near Potomac, he said. Miles from anything, no jacket, barely shoes, alive. Who is he? Travis hesitated. Name's Caleb Rourke. I don't know him, but the deputy I know says he's catatonic. Won't respond to anything, just sits there. And when he does speak... Travis stopped, as if even repeating it felt dangerous. When he does speak what? I asked, my voice thin. He speaks languages nobody around here knows, Travis said. They recorded him. Sent it to someone. One of the guys in Missoula said it sounded like Latin. Another said it sounded like older. Like church languages. Like dead ones. My mouth went dry. Travis swallowed hard. And here's the part I don't like. They found him holding a handheld radio, battery dead. The last frequency in the memory was 7.4. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen with the lights off, the only glow coming from the stove's coals and my phone screen. Juniper lay at my feet, but she wasn't asleep. Her ears kept turning toward the radio room, like she could hear something I couldn't. I stared at my radio logbook on the table, the neat handwriting from a hobby that had always felt harmless. Now, those pages felt like a trail. I made a decision that felt like slamming a door inside my own head. I would isolate. Not just turn off the radio. Not just don't transmit. I would make my house quiet. I shut down everything that didn't need to be on. I turned off the Wi-Fi router. I unplugged the television. I pulled the plug on the microwave because I'd once read a story about interference and my mind was in a place where superstition could dress itself up as caution. Then I went into the radio room with a pair of gloves on, as if touching the equipment barehanded might count as engaging. I unplugged the transceiver completely and carried it into the bedroom closet, setting it on the floor behind winter boots and a stack of old blankets. I unplugged the power supply. I disconnected the coax and ran it outside to the antenna so there was no feed line coming into the room. I took down the microphone and wrapped it in aluminum foil like an idiot, then wrapped it again because the first layer didn't feel like enough. I shut the laptop down and pulled the battery out. I didn't stop until the radio room shelf looked like an abandoned workstation, empty and harmless. Then I did something I'd never done before. I flipped the main breaker for the radio room circuit, cutting power to that part of the house entirely. Finally, I stood there in the dim light from the kitchen doorway, staring at the now dead room, and I whispered to Juniper, "We're done with it." She looked at me with the kind of dog expression that isn't judgment exactly, but isn't comfort either. That night, I went to bed early. I brought Juniper into the bedroom and shut the door. I left the hallway light on. I didn't sleep. At 11:58, the house creaked the way it always does when it cools. At midnight, the wind shifted and a branch tapped the window. And then, from somewhere inside the wall behind the headboard, came a sound like someone clearing their throat quietly. I froze. Juniper lifted her head, ears rigid. The sound came again, slightly closer, as if the drywall itself were a thin skin and something on the other side was learning how to use it. Then the whisper came. Not through electronics, not through the air as a normal sound, but somehow through the structure, making the wood seem to vibrate with the words. Evan. I felt my pulse in my teeth. My mind scrambled for explanations. Mice, plumbing, the house settling. But the voice didn't belong to any of those. It spoke again, with a softness that was almost polite. You hear us. I clamped my jaw shut so hard my teeth hurt. I stared at the wall. I didn't move. Juniper started whining, low and urgent, her body pressed against my leg. The voice waited. A full 10 seconds passed, and the silence in between felt intentional, like a person holding their breath to see if you'll react. Then, very quietly, it said something new. We are not the radio. The words slid into my brain like oil. My skin prickled. I could feel the shape of the sentence, how wrong it was, how it sounded like an answer to a question I hadn't asked out loud. The voice continued, still soft. The radio was a door. You opened it. I squeezed my eyes shut, as if that could keep the words from taking root. I thought of every scary story I'd ever heard where acknowledging something gives it power. I thought of the emergency alert, blunt and absolute. Do not respond. I didn't speak. Juniper's whining turned into a low growl that vibrated through her chest. The voice chuckled. Not a human chuckle. More like the sound a throat makes when it tries to imitate laughter without understanding why laughter happens. Good, it whispered. You learn. A faint tapping began again, somewhere in the wall, like fingers walking along studs. It moved slowly toward the bedroom door. My mind flashed through images. The voice slipping under the door like smoke, coming into the hallway, moving through the house until there was nowhere left to retreat. The emergency alert hadn't said run, it hadn't said hide, it had only said one thing. Do not respond. As if the whole problem could be solved by silence. The tapping reached the door. There was a pause. Then the doorknob turned. Not fast, not forceful, just a gentle testing, like someone checking if it's locked. I hadn't locked it. I stared at it, unable to move, my body refusing to believe the door could open without a person on the other side. The knob turned again, and the latch clicked. The door eased inward an inch. Juniper exploded into barking, lunging off the bed and slamming into the door with her shoulder. She planted herself in the gap, teeth bared, barking into the hallway like there was something standing there. I saw nothing. The hallway light cast a pale strip across the floorboards. Dust floated in it, slow and indifferent. But Juniper's eyes tracked something low to the ground, something moving along the baseboard towards the radio room. I swallowed hard and forced myself to do something I'd been taught in every dangerous situation I'd ever heard about. Don't panic, do a task. I reached for the nightstand, grabbed my flashlight and flicked it on. The beam cut down the hallway bright and harsh. Nothing. Juniper kept barking, and between her barks I heard the whisper again, not from a direction but from the space itself, as if it could be anywhere it wanted. "Do not answer," it said, mocking the alert with the same words. Yes, that is what they tell you. My throat tightened. My brain screamed to shout back, to demand it stop, to curse, to do anything that would prove I still had agency. I didn't. I stood there, shaking, flashlight beam steady only because my whole arm had locked. The voice continued, soft as breath. "They think silence saves you." Juniper's barking changed, turned into something confused, as if she could no longer find the target. The voice said, "But you hear us anyway." Then it did something that made my stomach turn. It spoke in Travis's voice, not an imitation that sounded like a stranger doing an impression. It sounded exactly like him, down to the lazy Montana drawl and the way he says my name when he's trying to sound serious. "Evan," the voice said, as Travis, "Hey man, it's me. Listen, I need you to talk to me." My eyes burned, my hands clenched. The emergency alert hadn't prepared me for this. It hadn't said, "It will sound like someone you love." It hadn't said, "It will use your instincts against you." It just said, "Do not respond." Travis's voice, its voice, said again, "Evan, answer me, okay? Just say something so I know you're there." My jaw trembled. I tasted copper where I'd bitten the inside of my cheek. Juniper whined again. A terrified sound now and backed toward me, her tail tucked. The voice shifted, becoming my father's voice from years ago, the voice I still heard sometimes when I was half asleep. "Ev," it said gently, "come on, don't shut me out." My chest tightened so hard it felt like I couldn't breathe. My whole body leaned forward a fraction, an involuntary movement toward the sound. I forced myself to step back. Silence stretched. Then, as if disappointed, the voice dropped the borrowed tone and returned to its original wrongness. "You are full of voices," it whispered. "We only choose one." The hallway light flickered. Not the kind of flicker that happens when a bulb is dying. A deliberate pulse, as if something had blinked. The tapping started again, but this time it wasn't in the wall. It was in the floor, directly in front of the radio room door down the hall. Tap, tap, tap. 3 taps, perfectly spaced. Then the radio room door, which I'd shut earlier, swung open on its own with a slow, steady motion. The room beyond was dark, breaker off, no power, no equipment. But the whisper came from inside it, deep in the dead space where my antenna feed line used to enter, where the foam and silicone sealed the hole. "Door," it said, like it was proud. Juniper let out a sharp bark and then fell silent, trembling. I stood in the bedroom doorway, flashlight beam aimed into the radio room, and saw nothing except darkness and the faint outline of the empty shelf. Then the beam caught something that made my stomach lurch. On the wall near the bulkhead plate there was a mark. Not a burn, not a stain. A mark like a shallow dent pressed into the drywall from the inside, the paper surface stretched outward, as if something had pushed gently against it. The shape wasn't a handprint. It was too smooth. It looked impossibly like the outline of a mouth pressed from the other side, lips flattened against the wall, as if someone had leaned in close to whisper through drywall. The mark moved, just slightly, sliding along the wall a few inches, leaving the paper surface wrinkled behind it. I stumbled backward, almost tripping over Juniper, and slammed the bedroom door shut. My hands shook so hard the doorknob rattled. I locked it. I pressed my back against the door and tried to breathe. On the other side, the whisper came again, muffled now. "Evan." I clamped a hand over my mouth like I could physically prevent a response. The voice waited. And then, quieter, almost kindly, it said, "You do not have to speak. We can use the other way." The light in the bedroom flickered. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. I didn't want to look, but I did, because part of my brain still believed in normal things like screens and text. The phone lit up with a new alert. It wasn't from the county. It wasn't from the emergency alert system. It was from my own Notes app. A blank note, timestamped just now, opened on the screen. Words appeared, letter by letter, as if someone were typing. "Hello, Evan." My blood went cold. I hadn't touched the phone. Another line appeared. "You hear us." Another. "Do not respond." Another. "Good." My vision tunneled. The room felt smaller, air thick. The voice from the hallway whispered through the door, synced perfectly with the text on the screen. "You hear us," it breathed. I turned the phone face down as if that could stop it. The whisper continued anyway. In that moment, I understood something that made the emergency alert feel almost laughable. The warning wasn't about radio etiquette. It was about attention. The voices weren't confined to a frequency. The frequency was just how they got noticed. Once you noticed, once the shape of them settled into your mind, they didn't need the radio anymore. They could come through anything that carried a signal, and when there were no signals left, they could come through the smallest cracks in your own habits. Memory, fear, the urge to answer when someone says your name. I stayed in that bedroom until dawn. Juniper pressed against my side, my hands locked together to keep them from shaking. The whisper came and went through the night, sometimes close, sometimes distant. It tried different voices. It tried different tones. It offered comfort. It offered threats without ever raising volume. It never once asked me to do anything specific. It just wanted me to respond. When daylight finally filtered through the blinds, pale and weak, the whisper faded. Not gone exactly. More like it had stepped back, patient. Juniper finally slept, exhausted. I didn't. The first thing I did when the sun was fully up was pack. If the house was compromised, if the door was the structure itself, then staying inside it felt like staying in a net. I dug out my cold weather gear, insulated boots, thick socks, snow pants, coat, gloves, a knit cap. I filled a backpack with essentials the way you do when you've lived in Montana long enough to understand that weather doesn't care about your plans. Water, protein bars, first aid kit, headlamp, batteries, a small hatchet, a lighter, extra layers, a paper map because my phone suddenly felt like a traitor. Then, because I'm still a person who likes tools that make sense, I pulled my old handheld ham radio out of a drawer. And then I stared at it like it was a snake. Radios had always been my connection to the world. Now they felt like open windows you couldn't close. I left it on the table. I did bring a simple NOAA weather radio, the kind that only receives, because I needed to know if a storm was coming. Even that felt like cheating. Before I left, I went to the radio room one last time. The breaker was still off. The room was cold. The dent in the drywall was still there, faint in daylight but unmistakable, like a bruise beneath paper skin. I stared at it, my stomach tight. A thought came into my mind that wasn't mine, smooth and calm. Say goodbye. My mouth opened a fraction. Juniper barked sharply behind me, snapping me back like a slap. I shut my mouth hard and stepped out of the room. I locked the house. I don't know why. Locks are for people. Then I drove. My first impulse was to go to Missoula, where there were hospitals and police and lots of people. But the alert had said emergency networks, and that meant whatever was happening wasn't local. It wasn't just one valley. It wasn't just one county. And Travis had said whole towns were reporting it. If the voices were spreading, a city might just mean more doors. So I did the opposite of what you're supposed to do in an emergency. I went deeper into the woods. There's an old Forest Service lookout up on a ridge not far from where Highway 83 bends north of Sealy, a place I'd hiked to once in late summer. It's not staffed year-round anymore. In winter, it's usually empty, accessed by a rough road that becomes impassable after heavy snow. But the cold front had left the roads hard. My truck, a four-wheel drive with decent tires, could make it as far as the lower trailhead. From there, it was a hike. I parked in a turnout, shouldered my pack, clipped Juniper's leash, and started up. The forest swallowed us quickly. The sound of the highway faded. Snow crunched under my boots in a steady rhythm that felt grounding, almost soothing. The air smelled like pine and cold metal. As we climbed, the world opened up in glimpses. Distant ridges, white valleys, a hard blue sky. For a while, I felt almost normal. Movement helps, effort helps. It's hard to be terrified when your lungs are burning and your legs are working. But every so often, I would hear something that made my skin prickle. A whisper on the wind that sounded almost like my name. A faint tapping that seemed to come from the trees. Once, I heard Juniper stop and growl at a patch of snow as if something invisible had crossed it. I looked. There were no tracks. By mid-afternoon, we reached the lookout. It was a simple structure, a small cabin on stilts, windows on all sides, a catwalk around it, a metal roof dusted with snow. The door was secured with a padlock, but the lock was old and the hasp was loose. I didn't feel good about breaking in, but the world had shifted into a place where rules like that felt irrelevant. I used the hatchet carefully, prying the hasp enough to slip the lock free without destroying it completely. Then I stepped inside. The air was stale and cold. A small wood stove sat in the corner, blackened from past use. There was a table, a bench, some old logbooks in a cabinet. The windows gave me a view of miles of forest in every direction, and for the first time since the voice said my name, I felt a faint sense of distance. No walls with coax holes, no radio room, no familiar door. I sat up like a person preparing for a storm. I checked the stovepipe. I gathered deadfall from the surrounding trees, splitting some into kindling. I lit a small fire and watched it catch, the warmth slowly easing into the cabin. Juniper explored, sniffing every corner, then settled near the stove with a low sigh. I sat at the table and opened one of the old logbooks. Most entries were weather observations and fire reports from summers past, but near the back, in a different handwriting, there were notes from someone who'd been up here during a winter storm years ago. Small, practical notes about wind direction and visibility. And one entry that made my blood run cold. Do not answer when you hear your name. No date, no signature. Just that line, written hard into the paper like the person had pressed the pen down too much. My eyes moved over it again and again. I flipped the page, nothing else. I stared out the window at the trees, suddenly feeling like this place wasn't empty, like it had a memory. That night, I kept the fire low and didn't turn on my phone. I didn't turn on the weather radio. I sat in the dim warmth and listened to the normal sounds. Wind around the eaves, the stove ticking, Juniper's breathing. For a few hours, nothing happened. Hope is dangerous because it makes you let your guard down without realizing it. At around 2 a.m, Juniper sat up and stared at the window. Her ears were forward, her body stiff. I followed her gaze. Outside, the forest was black, the snow faintly luminous under starlight. I didn't see anything. Then, on the glass, fog appeared. A small patch, as if someone had exhaled onto the window from outside. My breath caught. The cabin was warm. Outside was far below freezing. Fog on the outside of the glass would mean warmth and moisture on the other side. Another patch appeared beside it. Then a third. The shapes were round, close together, like the prints of fingertips pressing gently onto the cold glass. They slid, slowly, leaving streaks in the frost. Juniper let out a low growl. I stood up, heart hammering, and forced myself not to speak. The fog patches rearranged. And then, as if someone were writing with invisible fingers, letters appeared on the glass, drawn through the frost. EVAN, my name, etched into ice. My stomach twisted. A whisper came from the stove. Not from the air above it, not from the chimney, but from the iron itself, as if the metal had learned to carry sound. "Do you hear us?" Juniper barked, snapping toward the stove. Her fur bristled. I stepped back instinctively, my mind racing. The stove was a piece of iron. It had no electronics, no wires, no speakers. The whisper came again, calm and patient. "You ran." I clenched my fists until my nails bit my palms. I didn't respond. I didn't even let myself form a word silently. The voice continued anyway, as if my silence was simply another condition it could work around. "We are in the things that carry," it whispered. "Wire, air, wood, bone." The last word hit like a weight. Bone. My teeth clenched hard enough to ache. The frost writing on the window changed. The letters blurred and reformed into a new phrase. "Answer," then, underneath it, another. "Not with your mouth." My phone, which I'd kept powered down in my pack, vibrated. Not a buzz from an alert. A steady vibration like a heartbeat. I stared at the pack like it might move on its own. Juniper whined, backing away from it. The voice from the stove whispered, "Other way." And suddenly, a thought slid into my mind, smooth, calm, and not mine. Just nod. It wasn't an instruction in words at first. It was an impulse, a gentle push, the way your body leans toward a sound you recognize. My head tilted a fraction before I caught myself. The emergency alert had been specific about responding, but it hadn't said anything about nodding. "That's how it gets you," my mind whispered back at itself. "It makes you negotiate." I forced my neck stiff, staring straight ahead. The whisper turned soft, coaxing. "You do not have to speak. You do not have to transmit. You only have to acknowledge." The frost letters on the window shifted again. "We see you." My throat tightened. The air in the cabin changed. The warmth from the stove felt less like warmth and more like breath, as if the room itself were alive. Juniper barked again, but her bark sounded wrong, flat, as if the sound had been dampened. The whisper came from everywhere at once now. Stove, window, floor, the wooden beams above my head. "You think the warning was to protect you," it said, calm and certain. It was to protect them. The words made my mind snag. Protect who? I didn't ask. I didn't even think it clearly because I could feel how curiosity opened space inside me. The voice answered anyway because it didn't need my permission. "Those who listen for you," it whispered. "Those who answer for you. Those who would come." My phone vibrated again, harder. The pack shifted slightly on the floor as if something inside it had moved. Juniper lunged forward, teeth bared, and snapped at the pack without touching it, like she was afraid contact mattered. I reacted without thinking. I grabbed the pack and flung it across the cabin toward the far wall. It hit with a dull thump. The vibration stopped. Silence filled the cabin for half a second, thick and heavy. Then the whisper laughed again, that wrong imitation of laughter, and the frost writing on the window wiped itself clean as if a hand had swept across it from the outside. Juniper backed toward me, trembling. The voice became quiet, intimate, almost gentle. "You are clever," it said, "but clever is still listening." I held my breath. I did not respond. The whisper faded, retreating into the crackle of the stove, the wind outside, the normal world sounds. But it wasn't gone. It felt patient. Like it could wait for the moment my guard dropped. The moment I spoke to the dog, the moment I muttered to myself, the moment I answered my own name out of habit. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. At dawn, with my hands shaking and my eyes burning, I did something I never thought I would do. I wrote a note. Not on my phone, not on a computer. On paper, with a pen, in big block letters, and I taped it to the table where I would see it every time I moved. Do not respond. Not out loud. Not in your head. Not with a nod. Not with a look. I didn't know if it mattered, but I needed rules. By mid-morning, smoke from my small fire drifted out of the chimney in a thin line. I worried the smoke might draw attention. Human attention, which I suddenly wanted and feared at the same time. I turned on the NOAA weather radio long enough to hear the forecast. Clear, cold, no storm, wind light. Then I shut it off and stared at it, wondering if I'd just opened a door again. Hours passed. I forced myself to eat. Juniper stayed close, watching corners, occasionally growling at nothing. In the afternoon, I heard the first helicopter. A distant chop of blades, faint against the mountains. It grew louder, then faded, then returned. Search pattern. My first thought was relief. My second thought was terror. The voice had said, "Those who would come." If rescue meant more people hearing their name, more people responding, more people disappearing. Was I the problem? Had I become a beacon? I stood on the catwalk and scanned the sky. Eventually, I saw it. A dark helicopter moving low over the ridgeline, likely from the county or state, searching for something. The sun flashed on its windshield. I waved both arms, frantic. Then I froze. Because the emergency alert hadn't told people to avoid me. It had told them not to respond to voices. But if I drew attention, would I be dragging them toward the thing that wanted attention? The helicopter continued past, not seeing me. I let my arms drop slowly. I went back inside and sat at the table, breathing hard, the note staring at me like an accusation. That evening, as the light faded, my phone, still off, still in my pack, vibrated once. A single pulse. Like a knock. Juniper's head snapped toward it. I stared at the pack and felt the urge to grab the phone, to check messages, to see if Travis had called, to see if there were updates, to see if anyone had figured out what was happening. The urge felt like hunger. And under it, like a thread woven through, was the whisper of the voice, not audible but present, the shape of it pressing against my thoughts. Listen. I closed my eyes. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't respond. I breathed slowly and focused on the simplest thing, the sound of my own breathing, the weight of Juniper's body against my leg, the faint pop of the stove. For a moment, it felt like the cabin was just a cabin again. Then the whisper came from the logbook on the table, from the paper itself, so faint I almost thought it was my imagination. Evan. My eyes opened. The logbook lay still, pages unmoving. But the ink on the warning line, "Do not answer when you hear your name," looked darker, as if freshly written. And beneath it, in a handwriting that matched my own block letters from the note, a new line had appeared. "You already did." My stomach dropped, because I knew what it meant. I hadn't spoken on the air, I hadn't answered out loud, but that first night in my radio room, I'd whispered into the darkness, "Yeah, I hear you." I had responded. And now, whatever this was, voice, presence, signal, hunger, had marked me as someone who could be reached without wires. Juniper growled low, staring at the wall. Behind the cabin walls, the faint tapping began again. Not in the radio room of my house miles away. Here, in this lookout tower, built of wood and nails and glass in the middle of winter forest. Tap, tap, tap. Then, from directly behind the wall at my back, a whisper, so close it felt like breath on my neck. "Door?" I went cold all over. I stood up slowly, not turning around because something in my instincts told me not to give it the satisfaction of my attention. I kept my eyes on the window, on the darkening forest beyond. The whisper continued, softer, almost affectionate. "You brought us with you." Juniper barked once, sharp and desperate, and pressed against my legs as if trying to push me away from the wall. I swallowed. My throat tightened. My mind raced. If silence was the only defense, then I had to become silent in ways I'd never practiced. No muttering, no thinking my own name, no answering even in reflex. I forced my breathing to slow. I stared out at the forest and did the only thing that felt like fighting. I refused to acknowledge. Behind me, the tapping became a slow drag, like something moving along the inside of the wall, searching for seams. The whisper slid into my mind again, smooth and calm. "Just look." My eyes flicked toward the side, a tiny movement. The whisper laughed quietly, pleased. "See," it said, "you respond." The cabin lights, there were none. But the last of daylight in the windows dimmed as the sun dropped behind the ridge and the room became shadowed. In the dark, the voice didn't need radio. It didn't need screens. It didn't even need sound. It had my attention now, whether I wanted to give it or not. I backed away from the wall slowly, one step at a time, keeping Juniper close. The whisper followed, sliding through the structure like smoke. "Evan," it said again. And this time, the word didn't sound distorted. It sounded like my own voice, spoken perfectly, as if the thing had finally learned how to wear it. My mouth opened before I could stop it, my muscles preparing to answer my own voice out of pure reflex. Juniper snapped at my hand, not hard enough to break skin, but hard enough to shock me. Her teeth grazed my knuckle, and the sting snapped me back into myself. I gasped, and then clamped my mouth shut, heart hammering. The whisper paused, as if considering the dog. Then it said, in a tone that made my stomach twist, "Good dog." The tapping stopped. Silence flooded the cabin. I stood there shaking, hand throbbing, Juniper trembling against my leg. Outside, the forest was still. Inside, the air felt full, crowded, as if something had stepped back into a corner and folded itself up to wait. I understood then that the warning, "Do not respond," was not a solution. It was a delay, a way to buy time. And time was exactly what whatever this was seemed to have. Because it didn't need me to answer right now. It just needed me to live long enough to slip, once, in the smallest way. A muttered curse when I stubbed my toe. A sleepy what when I heard my name. A whispered apology to my dog. A thought shaped like speech. And then, if the stories were true, the world would look around and find an open door and see no tracks in the snow, and tell itself whatever story it needed to tell to keep going. That night, I didn't turn on any device. I didn't write. I didn't read. I didn't even let myself hum. I sat in the dark with Juniper, listening to the stove and the wind and the quiet. Every so often, I felt the presence press close, like a face near glass waiting for fog. And every time the urge rose in me to speak, to demand it stop, to call Travis, to pray, to scream, I swallowed it down and held still. Because now I knew the truth. A truth I wished I could warn the world about in words that wouldn't themselves become a door. The voices don't want your radio. They want your response. And once they have it, they don't need a frequency anymore. They only need you. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.